The elderly man in the gray suit and blue tie paused at the entrance of the Azure, the most exclusive restaurant in the city. His weathered hands trembled slightly as he straightened his tie, a small gesture of dignity before entering a world where he knew he might not be welcome. Through the elegant glass doors, he could see crystal chandeliers casting golden light over pristine white tablecloths and polished silver cutlery. The soft melody of a live piano floated through the air. He took a deep breath, steadying himself, and stepped inside. "Excuse me, sir." The host's voice was clipped, his eyes moving quickly over the old man's worn gray suit, noting the slight shine at the elbows and the conservative cut that had gone out of style years ago. "Do you have a reservation?" "No, I don't," the elderly man replied softly, his voice carrying the gentle authority of someone who had once commanded respect. "I was hoping to have dinner tonight. It's a special anniversary for me." Several patrons turned to stare, their expressions a mixture of curiosity and discomfort. A woman in diamonds whispered something to her companion, who smirked in response. Marcus Reynolds, the restaurant manager, approached with a practiced smile that didn't reach his eyes. Tall and immaculately dressed in a tailored navy suit, he positioned himself between the old man and the dining room, like a gatekeeper. "I'm afraid we're fully booked this evening." His gaze lingered on the slight fraying at the old man's collar, the scuffed shoes that had been polished but couldn't hide their age. "Perhaps you'd be more comfortable somewhere, more suitable to your situation." The elderly gentleman stood straighter, his dignity unwavering despite the public humiliation. His blue eyes, still sharp beneath bushy gray eyebrows, surveyed the half-empty restaurant. "I understand you have empty tables. I can see them from here." "Those are for guests with reservations," Marcus replied coldly, his tone making it clear the conversation was over. "Besides, our prefix menu starts at $250 per person. I doubt that's within your budget." Several diners had turned to watch the uncomfortable scene unfolding. A couple nearby exchanged uncomfortable glances. The old man's face flushed with embarrassment, a dull red creeping up from his collar, but his eyes remained steady, betraying neither anger nor defeat. "I can afford your menu," he said quietly, twisting the worn navy ring on his finger, a habit formed over decades when faced with difficult situations. Marcus's laugh was like ice shattering. "Sir, I think we both know that's not true. Now, there's a diner 3 blocks down that might be more appropriate. I need to ask you to leave before you disturb our guests further." The old man stood motionless for a moment, dignity wrapping around him like armor. Then he nodded once, a gesture that spoke of a lifetime of accepting life's blows with grace, and turned to leave. But as he reached for the door, a tall man in an impeccable suit rose from a corner table, his eyes fixed on something glinting on the elderly man's hand. "Wait!" he called out, his voice cutting through the murmur of conversation. "That ring! May I see it?" Walter Sullivan hadn't always been invisible. There was a time when his presence commanded respect, when his orders meant the difference between life and death on the high seas. But that was 50 years ago, before his hair turned white and his shoulders began to stoop with age, before the world started looking through him instead of at him. After Marcus humiliated him at the restaurant entrance, Walter stood outside the Azure, fighting the familiar ache of dismissal that had become all too common in his later years. The cool evening air brushed against his face as he watched well-dressed couples enter the restaurant, none of them giving him a second glance. He looked down at the navy ring on his finger, faded gold surrounding a deep blue stone with an anchor emblem. He never took it off, not in 5 decades. It had been there through combat, through marriage, through the birth of his son, through his wife's funeral. The ring had become part of him, a silent witness to a life fully lived. What no one at the restaurant knew, what few people anywhere knew, was that Commander Walter Sullivan had once been responsible for one of the most daring rescues in naval history. During a violent storm off the Vietnamese coast in 1975, when others had deemed a rescue mission too dangerous, he had maneuvered his vessel alongside a sinking transport ship, saving 23 men from certain death. The winds that night had howled like banshees, waves crashing over the deck, threatening to swallow both ships whole. But Walter had held steady, personally hauling several men from the churning waters when they fell short in their desperate jumps between vessels. But Walter never spoke of his medals, which lay in a simple wooden box at home. He never mentioned the letter of commendation from the president that was framed but hung in his small home office rather than his living room. Heroism, to Walter, wasn't something to parade around. It was simply doing what needed to be done when others couldn't or wouldn't step up. After his naval career, Walter James Sullivan had quietly founded the Second Chance Veterans Foundation. Using his modest pension and careful investments, he had built an organization that provided medical care, housing assistance, and psychological support to veterans struggling to rebuild their lives after service. The foundation operated from a small office downtown, with a staff of 5 and dozens of volunteers, many of them veterans themselves or family members of those who had served. "Some wounds don't bleed," Walter often told the foundation volunteers during training. "Those are usually the deepest ones." He would know. He had seen the 1,000-yard stares, the hands that couldn't stop shaking, the nights spent fighting battles that had ended decades ago but still raged in the mind. One particular case had stayed with him through the years. A young Marine named Michael, who had lost both legs in combat and was contemplating suicide when Walter found him in the VA hospital, staring blankly at the wall. Walter had spent 3 days sitting with Michael, talking about everything and nothing, until the young man agreed to try rehabilitation. Today, Michael coached wheelchair basketball and had 2 children who adored him. He called Walter every Christmas without fail. Walter lived simply in a modest 2-bedroom house in an aging neighborhood. His wife Emma had passed 5 years ago, and he donated most of their savings to expand the foundation's mental health services. The neighborhood children knew him as the kind old man who fixed bicycles in his garage and always had peppermint candies in his pockets. Last summer, he had taught 3 of them how to fish, showing the same patience he once showed young sailors learning to navigate by stars. What Walter didn't know as he stood outside the restaurant was that his life was about to change dramatically. Because 50 years ago, during that rescue mission in the South China Sea, the last man he'd pulled from the churning waters was a terrified 19-year-old sailor named Thomas Reed. And Thomas had never forgotten the commander's steady hands and the glint of a Navy ring as Walter hauled him to safety just before the transport ship slipped beneath the waves. While the world saw an elderly man in a slightly worn suit, they missed the greatness walking quietly among them. They didn't see the hundreds of lives he'd saved, first at sea, then on land through his foundation. They didn't see how he visited the VA hospital every Wednesday, sitting with veterans who had no other visitors, reading to those who couldn't read for themselves anymore. They didn't see how he taught sailing to troubled teens in the summer, showing them how to find direction when lost. They didn't see how he had taken in his neighbor's cat when she passed away, even though he was allergic, because he'd promised her he would. This was the man Marcus Reynolds had just turned away from his restaurant, the man he had judged as unworthy based on nothing more than the age of his suit and the wrinkles on his face. Thomas Reed watched the interaction from his private table in the corner of the restaurant. He was hosting potential investors, but something about the elderly gentleman had caught his attention, something familiar in his posture, in the dignified way he held himself despite the humiliation. But it was when the old man twisted the ring on his finger that Thomas felt the jolt of recognition ripple through him like an electric current. He rose immediately, abandoning his dinner companions mid-conversation, their faces registering surprise at his sudden movement. "That ring," he called out, his voice carrying across the restaurant. "May I see it?" The restaurant fell silent, conversations dying mid-sentence as all eyes turned to the scene unfolding. Waiters paused with trays balanced on their fingertips. The pianist stopped playing. Walter hesitated at the door, surprised by the interruption to his quiet exit. Then, with the natural courtesy that had defined his life, he extended his hand toward the stranger. Thomas approached quickly, his heart pounding against his ribs, and looked first at the ring, then into Walter's eyes, blue eyes that he remembered staring into as a young sailor convinced he was about to die. "Commander Sullivan?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper, trembling with emotion. Walter's brow furrowed in concentration as he studied the face of the well-dressed man before him. There was something familiar in the set of his jaw, but 5 decades had transformed the terrified young sailor into the confident man who now stood before him. "Do I know you, son?" Thomas smiled, emotion tightening his throat. "USS Concordia, March 14, 1975, South China Sea." He swallowed hard before continuing. "You pulled me from the water when I'd given up hope. I was the radio operator, the last one off the transport." Walter's eyes widened in recognition, memories flooding back, the howling wind, the freezing water, the young sailor's fingers slipping from the rescue line on his first attempt. The young radio man, Reed, Thomas Reed. "Yes, sir," Thomas confirmed, fighting back tears that threatened to spill. He impulsively reached out and clasped Walter's shoulder. "You saved my life that night." Marcus Reynolds approached, sensing something significant was happening that might affect his most valued client. His expression wavered between concern and calculation. "Mr. Reed, is everything all right? Is this man bothering you?" Thomas turned to Marcus, his expression hardening, the warmth that had suffused his features moments before replaced by something colder and more dangerous. "This man, as you call him, is Commander Walter Sullivan, and he's the only reason I'm alive today." Marcus paled, his eyes darting between the two men. "I don't understand." "Let me explain it then," Thomas said, his voice carrying through the now silent restaurant. 50 years ago, Commander Sullivan piloted a rescue mission during a typhoon that saved 23 men, including me. He received the Navy Cross for his bravery, the second highest honor in the naval service. Walter shifted uncomfortably under the sudden attention. "It was my duty, nothing more." "It was extraordinary," Thomas countered firmly, "and apparently nothing has changed." He turned to address the entire restaurant, his business instincts taking over. "Ladies and gentlemen, I want to introduce you to Commander Walter Sullivan, one of the most decorated naval officers of his generation, and the founder of the Second Chance Veterans Foundation, which has helped thousands of veterans rebuild their lives." Murmurs spread through the restaurant as people began to recognize the name. The foundation was well known for its work, though it rarely sought publicity. Several patrons shifted uncomfortably, perhaps regretting their earlier dismissive glances. "Commander," Thomas continued, placing his hand gently on Walter's back, "would you join me for dinner?" "It would be my honor." Walter hesitated, then nodded. "Thank you, son. That would be nice." His voice was steady, but those who looked closely might have noticed the slight moisture gathering at the corners of his eyes. As Thomas guided Walter to his table, where his abandoned dinner companions watched with undisguised curiosity, he leaned close. "I've been looking for you for years, Commander, to thank you properly." "No thanks needed," Walter replied, his hand resting briefly on Thomas's arm. "I'm just glad you made something of the life you were given." "I did," Thomas said, a note of pride in his voice. "And actually, there's something else you should know." He gestured around them at the elegant restaurant with its crystal and silver. "I own this restaurant, and several others." Walter chuckled softly, the sound rusty but genuine. Well, I'll be damned. The evening had just begun, and already it had become far more than the quiet commemoration Walter had planned. As he took his seat at Thomas's table, he noticed Marcus watching from across the room, his expression unreadable. "Would you take a moment to subscribe to our channel? We share stories like Walter's that remind us of the quiet heroes walking among us, people whose greatest achievements often go unseen. Hit that subscribe button to make sure you never miss these powerful moments of truth." The following morning, Thomas personally drove to Walter's modest home in his gleaming black Mercedes, drawing curious stares from neighborhood children playing in the street. He found the commander in his garage, patiently teaching a neighborhood boy with thick glasses how to repair a bicycle chain. The garage was neat but well used, with tools organized on pegboards and several bicycles in various states of repair. "Just a minute," Walter called when Thomas knocked at the open garage door. After wiping his hands on a rag and giving the boy an encouraging pat on the shoulder, he approached Thomas with a warm smile. "Mr. Reed, this is unexpected." "Please, it's Thomas," he insisted, looking around at the humble surroundings with new eyes, seeing not the modesty of the home, but the richness of a life well lived. "I wanted to apologize again for how you were treated at my restaurant." Walter waved away the concern. "No harm done. I've grown used to being invisible at my age." There was no bitterness in his tone, just a matter-of-fact acceptance that made Thomas's heart ache. Thomas shook his head firmly. "That's exactly the problem, Commander. Men like you should never be invisible." He handed Walter a folder he'd brought with him. Inside was a yellowed newspaper article from 1975 with a photo of a young Walter in his dress uniform receiving his Navy Cross. Thomas had kept it all these years, a reminder of the man who had given him a second chance at life. "May I come in? There's something important I'd like to discuss." Over coffee in Walter's simple kitchen, mugs chipped but clean, served with store-brand cookies on a plain white plate, Thomas explained that after being rescued, he had made a promise to himself. If he survived and prospered, he would find ways to honor those who served. After leaving the Navy, he had used his GI Bill to get a business degree, eventually building a successful restaurant empire. But his true passion was his charitable foundation supporting military families. "Commander, I want to merge our foundations," Thomas proposed, leaning forward earnestly. "With my resources and your expertise, we could help tens of thousands more veterans." Your grassroots approach combined with my business connections could transform veteran care in this country. Walter sat quietly, turning his navy ring as he considered the proposal. Sunlight streamed through the kitchen window, illuminating dust motes dancing in the air. From a shelf nearby, a photograph of Emma seemed to watch the proceedings with quiet approval. "I've always kept a low profile with the foundation," Walter finally said. "The work matters, not who does it. And that's precisely why the world needs to know your story," Thomas insisted. "You've inspired me for 50 years. Think how many others you could inspire." He reached across the table, not quite touching Walter's hand, but close. "Commander, you pulled me from the water when I was drowning. Let me help you expand the lifeline you've thrown to so many others." Later that day, they returned to the Azure together. Thomas had called an emergency staff meeting, and every employee from the executive chef to the newest busboy stood at attention as Thomas entered with Walter. The atmosphere was tense, expectant. Marcus Reynolds looked distinctly uncomfortable, shifting his weight from foot to foot near the back of the group. "Yesterday," Thomas began, his voice carrying the authority of ownership, "a great man was treated disrespectfully in my establishment. This ends today." He turned to Walter, who stood tall despite his years, the same quiet dignity about him that had first caught Thomas's attention. "Commander Sullivan has agreed to partner with my foundation. From now on, every restaurant in our group will maintain a commander's table, reserved for veterans who might otherwise not be able to afford dining with us. Once a week, we will host veterans for a complimentary meal prepared with the same care we give our highest-paying customers." The staff applauded, some nodding in approval. A few glanced toward Marcus, whose face had turned a dull red. Thomas then turned to face his manager directly. "Mr. Reynolds, you have a choice to make. You can either personally apologize to the commander and undergo our new respect training program, or you can seek employment elsewhere." A hush fell over the assembled staff. Marcus hesitated, his pride warring visibly with self-preservation. Then, after a long moment, he stepped forward, genuine remorse gradually replacing the calculation in his expression. "Commander Sullivan, I was wrong, unforgivably wrong. I judged you by appearance, not character." He extended his hand. "If you'll allow me, I'd like to learn from my mistake." Walter studied the younger man, seeing beyond the polished exterior to the insecurity that often drives such behavior. Then he clasped Marcus's hand firmly. "We all make mistakes, son. It's what we do afterward that defines us." As they sealed their agreement, the restaurant staff broke into spontaneous applause. Several approached Walter afterward, some with tears in their eyes, sharing stories of their own military family members. One young waitress with a tattoo peeking from beneath her sleeve hugged Walter impulsively. "My grandfather was a Vietnam vet too," she said. "He never talked about it, but I know he suffered. Thank you for helping men like him." Walter's eyes glistened. For decades, he'd worked in the shadows, believing anonymity was best. Now he wondered if perhaps his story could serve a purpose beyond himself, if the very public nature he had avoided might actually further the cause he believed in so deeply. That evening, Walter was the guest of honor at a hastily arranged but elegant dinner at the Azure. Thomas had made calls throughout the day, and the response had been overwhelming. The mayor came, canceling a fundraiser to attend. So did 3 retired admirals, including one who had served with Walter. Dozens of veterans from Walter's foundation filled the restaurant, some in wheelchairs, others bearing visible scars of their service, all treating Walter with the respect that had been denied him just 24 hours earlier. As he looked around at the faces, some young, some old, all respectful, Walter felt a weight lifting. He had carried his memories and his mission alone for so long. Perhaps it was time to share the load. Thomas raised his glass. "To Commander Sullivan, who teaches us that heroism isn't just about one dramatic moment. It's about how you live every day afterward." Walter, uncomfortable with praise, simply nodded. But inside he felt a quiet pride, not for himself, but for the work he'd done, and for the work yet to come. In the days that followed, Walter's life transformed in ways he could never have anticipated. The story of the Navy veteran disrespected at a fine restaurant, and the surprising revelation of his heroism, had gone viral after a diner captured part of the confrontation on her phone. Reporters called, television shows requested interviews, old naval buddies reached out after decades of silence. Through it all, Walter maintained his essential modesty. When a morning show host asked about his heroism during the rescue mission, Walter simply replied, "I just did what anyone would have done." The real heroes are the ones who never came home. He redirected every question about himself to the work of the foundation, to the needs of veterans still struggling. The merger of the foundations proceeded rapidly, with Thomas insisting that Walter's name take precedence. The Sullivan Reed Veterans Foundation was now one of the largest private organizations supporting veterans in the country. They maintained Walter's grassroots approach while adding Thomas's business acumen and connections. Within weeks, they had secured commitments for 3 new veteran housing complexes and a specialized PTSD treatment center. Walter insisted on maintaining his simple life, though he did accept Thomas's gift of a new suit. For foundation business, Thomas had insisted with a smile. Walter wore it to board meetings and fundraisers, but still preferred his worn cardigan at home. He continued fixing bicycles for neighborhood children, though now sometimes reporters would lurk nearby, hoping for a photo or quote. He remained patient with them, just as he was patient with everyone. "They're just doing their job," he told a frustrated Thomas once. "No need to chase them off." 3 months after their reunion, Thomas and Walter stood together at the grand opening of the foundation's new headquarters. The building featured a wall of photographs, ordinary men and women whose service had been extraordinary. Walter had insisted on this display, wanting visitors to understand that heroism came in all forms. "Every one of these faces has a story," he told the assembled crowd during his brief remarks. "Most of them will never be told. That doesn't make them less important." Marcus Reynolds was there too. After completing his respect training, he had asked to volunteer with the foundation. Now he coordinated the Commander's Table program, which had expanded to every restaurant in Thomas's group and was being adopted by other establishments nationwide. The formerly arrogant manager had discovered a talent for connecting with veterans, particularly the younger ones who sometimes distrusted authority. "I've been thinking about what you said, Commander," Marcus told Walter quietly during the reception, as they watched a young veteran in a wheelchair demonstrating a specially adapted virtual reality system to a group of donors. "About how we're defined by what we do after our mistakes. Thank you for giving me the chance to define myself differently." Walter clasped the younger man's shoulder. "That's all any of us can ask for, son. A chance to be better tomorrow than we were yesterday." As the evening wound down, Walter found a quiet moment alone on the building's balcony. The city lights spread before him like earthbound stars. He twisted the navy ring on his finger, thinking of the young men he'd pulled from the water that stormy night so long ago. He thought of Emma, who would have been so proud of what was happening. He thought of all the veterans whose lives might be changed by this new chapter. At 78, Walter Sullivan had thought his greatest contributions were behind him. Now he realized they might just be beginning. Thomas joined him on the balcony, offering a glass of whiskey. "Penny for your thoughts, Commander." Walter smiled, accepting the drink. "I was just thinking that sometimes life's greatest gifts come disguised as its greatest humiliations." "How so?" "If I hadn't been turned away at your restaurant that night, we might never have reconnected." All of this, he gestured to the building behind them, to the new possibilities it represented, might never have happened. Thomas nodded thoughtfully. "The universe works in mysterious ways." "That it does, son," Walter agreed. "That it does." As they stood together watching the sunset, 2 men from different generations united by a single moment of courage 50 years ago, Walter felt a profound sense of peace. The navy ring on his finger, the one that had caught Thomas's eye that fateful evening, seemed to glow in the fading light. It was a reminder that no act of kindness, no moment of courage is ever truly lost. Sometimes it just takes 50 years for the ripples to come back to you. We often pass by greatness without recognizing it. The elderly man in worn clothes sitting alone at the park might be a decorated hero who once saved dozens of lives. The quiet woman at the bus stop might have served as a nurse in combat zones, holding the hands of the dying. The tired father in line at the grocery store might be raising a child with special needs, with extraordinary patience and love that few will ever witness. Walter Sullivan's story reminds us that dignity doesn't announce itself with fanfare. It doesn't arrive in expensive clothes or require reservations at fine restaurants. True dignity resides in character, in the choices we make when no one is watching, in the help we offer without expectation of reward or recognition, in the quiet persistence of goodness through a lifetime of challenges. In our world of instant judgments and surface evaluations, we miss the depth of the souls around us. We see age, not wisdom. We see worn clothing, not the battles fought. We see silence, not strength. We see wrinkles, not experience. We see gray hair, not the fire that still burns in hearts that have loved and lost and persevered. When Marcus Reynolds looked at Walter Sullivan, he saw an old man who didn't belong in his elegant establishment. He couldn't see the young commander who had once piloted a vessel through a raging storm to save 23 souls. He couldn't see the founder who had helped thousands of veterans rebuild shattered lives. He couldn't see the neighbor who taught local children to repair bicycles and always had a kind word and a peppermint candy. He couldn't see the widower who still set out 2 cups each morning before remembering his Emma was gone. He couldn't see the greatness standing before him. How many Walters have we turned away? How many times have we judged the book by its worn cover, missing the magnificent story within? How often have we denied ourselves the privilege of knowing extraordinary souls because they didn't fit our narrow definition of value? The next time you encounter someone who seems ordinary, remember Commander Sullivan and his Navy ring. Remember that heroism doesn't always shout. Sometimes it whispers in the quiet actions of everyday life. Remember that the most impressive people are often the least impressed with themselves. Remember that age may dim the step, but not the soul. And perhaps most importantly, remember that it's never too late to recognize greatness, to make amends, or to change the course of many lives. Marcus found redemption in service. Thomas found purpose in gratitude. Walter found that his life's mission was larger than he'd ever imagined. As Walter himself said, we're all defined by what we do after our mistakes. In that simple wisdom lies our path forward, as individuals and as a society that too often overlooks its quiet heroes. Let us look more deeply. Let us listen more carefully. Let us recognize the greatness that walks among us every day, unheralded but essential. Let us honor the Walters of our world, not just with words, but with the respect they have earned through lives of quiet significance.